All right, welcome back. We are now starting Unit 3, and in Unit 3, we're going to look at science, industry, and globalization from the 1850s to the present. What we're going to see today is kind of the end of the long 19th century. And with this end of the long 19th century, we're going to talk about one of the major outcomes of the Industrial Revolution. And what that involved was the beginning of globalization, particularly the imperial uh, efforts of the United Kingdom and the other Western European nations in the landmass of Africa. And then also mass democracy. Mass democracy is also one of the results of the Industrial Revolution. So we're going to begin in this lecture video by talking about mass democracy, and in the next lecture video, we are going to talk about imperialism. Next time for class, you're going to want to have read Frankfurter 649 through 669, which covers World War I. And you'll also want to look at the horrors of war and revolutionary Marxism defended. If you were to watch one film on World War I right now, I would encourage you to watch the film 1917. It was a film that I got for my birthday, and it was a really fantastic depiction of the Great War, which I will say when I lecture on the Great War next time, I'll probably interchangeably use the phrase the Great War and World War I because it was known as the Great War until World War II was taking place. Otherwise, they would not have known to call it World War I. All right, so let's go ahead and talk about mass democracy. Here are some of the major characteristics that helps us understand this major movement that is covering Western Europe during the 19th century. The first major idea behind mass democracy is universal male suffrage. Universal male suffrage is the idea that regardless of whether you own land, regardless of whatever your color is, regardless of whatever station or whatever religion you hold to, you have the right to participate in the democratic processes that your government permits. Now, that doesn't mean that there may not be a monarchy. England has a monarchy, but it also has a parliament, and those parliamentary representatives and the prime minister are all their offices exist because of a vote or an electing process. So, that said, along with the universal male suffrage is the development of political candidature. That's different than the processes for ministers of parliament prior to universal male suffrage. Prior to universal male suffrage, the candidates were often elected by their peers and other aristocratic influencers in the conservatistic world in which these people lived. So most ministers of parliament had a title and had land. Political candidature made it possible for bourgeoisie, untitled, and unlanded gentry to have positions of political influence. Political candidature also didn't just mean that you didn't have to be a conservatistic aristocrat to be a candidate, but it meant that you might actually have to go out and candidate for votes. In other words, you had to become nominated by others, and those nominations would occur by you going through some sort of process of telling people about your ideas, advertising yourself, making public statements, or engaging in public debate, all towards the end of being a candidate that's worthy of being nominated. That also led to fundraising because in order for you to candidate, you had to fundraise monies in order to have the time to candidate and the transportation to go from one place to another place, depending on the extent to which your jurisdiction would require you to do. Also, with candidature, you have the rise of political parties. The Jacobins, the Whigs, the Federalists, the Anti-Federalists. All of these are examples of political parties that existed throughout Europe and even in the Americas. And then also with candidature, there's going to be the involvement of political media and journalism, in which there's going to be sketches of these candidates so that this material is accessible to the masses that are going to be voting. There's also going to be political campaigns in which a candidate may promote himself, or a candidate and the people that are working and helping that candidate might say something that is going to cause other people to not vote for the other candidate, to do smear campaigns of some sort. For most British voters and trade union members, political democracy and industrial capitalism appear to be the key to global power and material prosperity at the start of the 20th century. The monopoly that the members of the state church, the Church of England, had long enjoyed over access to university education, civil service posts, and military appointments were now broken. And that was the case in England primarily. Most of the conservatives were members of the Church of England, and they were then had more likely to be accessible or have access to political office. Whereas other political candidature, when the mass democracy took place, people from other echelons of society outside of the Church of England might gain access to power and authority. Let's talk about the main 19th century figure that promoted democratic processes and mass democracy in 19th century England. William Gladstone held the role of Prime Minister of the United Kingdom 3 times, from 1868 to 1875, from 1880 to 1885, and from 1892 to 1894. In 1884, he created a major reform act that extended suffrage laws in towns to the countryside, so that basically 2/3 of males could vote at that time. Eventually, universal suffrage then does become available for all men in the United Kingdom. As the Prime Minister, he was able to promote democratization reforms that allowed all men, regardless of property and religion, to have the ability to cast a vote and to support people, and regardless of race as well. Education reform. He was the main leader of the Liberal Party for much of the 19th century, and he was the individual that was credited for creating the equality of opportunity, free trade, and laissez-faire economics form of government throughout the later part of the 19th century. When we talk about mass democracy and when we talk about nationalism, we also talk about Otto von Bismarck. In 1867, Otto von Bismarck formed the first German national state, the North German Confederation. He served as the minister-president of Prussia for 2 decades, from 1871 to 1890, underneath Wilhelm I. In the fall of 1884, he was the one who organized and coordinated the Berlin Conference, which we're going to talk about that more in our next lecture. The Berlin Conference was when the African scramble by the Western European nations took place. Throughout the 1870s, he was the promoter of the Kulturkampf, which was the culture struggle where the liberals struggled against the Catholics. And liberals gained power over the Catholics for all of the German Empire, which he formed the German Empire in 1871. And as the elected executive official of the German Empire underneath Wilhelm I, he instituted realpolitik, the politic of pragmatism, which is a politic of diplomacy where you consider what is the best policy to follow given the current circumstances and the factors that are taking place. These explicit ideological notions or moral and ethical premises are always driven by pragmatism. It's pragmatism applied to politics. His major contributions was being the major proponent of realpolitik or pragmatism in government. His diplomacy and his diplomatic measures as a kind of ironclad, iron-fisted, strong, absolutist leader, his diplomacy kept peace in Europe for 2 decades of rule. He is the one who singularly made Germany a international and world power. And then, of course, he was the person who unified Germany and gave it a sense of nationalism. As we're approaching the end of the 19th century, we basically have 4 world powers that come into being. These 4 world powers are the powers that are setting the stage for World War I taking place. So you have Germany, United Kingdom, France, and Russia. And so in the next lecture, we're going to talk about how all of these nations laid claim into Africa and had imperial reaches throughout the known world.